Last year, I came up with something at the very last minute of my closing keynote to talk about zero identity, being inspired by the zero trust movement. Steve Tout is in the room. He was kind enough to jump on this, and a few people have jumped on it and thought that the idea of zero identity was provocative enough to do something with. And so all I want to do today is to drill into what I meant, paradoxically, about zero identity at Identiverse and see if I can get away with it again. I'll start by telling you a bit more about myself. You probably all know that I'm Australian. You probably all know that I am a Sydney-sider, or you probably just assume I'm a Sydney-sider because most Americans think that Australians live in Sydney. In fact, the Sydney-siders themselves think that all the best people in Australia, of course, live in Sydney. But I'm not a Sydney-sider any longer. You're all wrong if you think I'm a Sydney-sider. I am a tree changer. My wife and I moved to the country almost exactly 1 year ago. So we are now country folk. Well, we think that we're country folk, but apparently it's not for us to say that we are locals as yet. I am, however, somewhat American. I lived in America for 3 years. My first child is American. I am, of course, a cis, middle-income, middle-aged white male, very conscious of what that is. Sometimes I wish I wasn't. I am a child of the 70s, music-wise, which is probably the most important attribute that people talk about, but I'm stuck somewhere between Hendrix and Dylan and Elvis Costello and Elvis and Patti Smith. And I identify with all of those four people, Hendrix and so on. And I got around any copyright thing because, of course, those are pictures of records from my collection. I am left-leaning. I'm going to be very careful to say that in the American sense of the word, I am liberal. But in the Australian sense of the word, I am Republican. But above all, I'm a Collingwood Magpies supporter, which is a problem because my wife is a Sydney Swans supporter, arch rivals, and she will not go to football games with me because she says that I'm a different person when I've got my Collingwood cap on. So I just said a whole bunch of things which you may or may not agree with or even relate to, but I'm in no doubt that you knew exactly what I meant in every single claim that I made about my weird identities, and it's because we humans are very good with identity. We exercise multitudes of identities seamlessly. We do it almost as part of the social currency. So that's great. But as they said in the 1960s, I think we're as human, but to really screw something up takes a computer. So when we digitise identity, we really screwed it up. Dave Birch, very good payments, fintech, identity consultant, nailed it a couple of years ago when he said that we are getting nowhere on digital identity. Identity fraud continues to spiral and we're drowning in fake news. Interesting. I don't disagree with the empirical assessment of Dave's, but he's focusing on identity fraud when in fact identity crime has nothing to do with identity. And we'll come back to that. And we'll also come back to this topic of fake news, sort of incidentally, when I try and explain that there is a world post-identity. It's going to have a lot to do with those social challenges of fake news and identity crime. Now we are here because, gosh, we're here for all sorts of reasons, but they all relate to this magnificent obsession that we have with identity. Favourite Marx Brothers movie, you know, they're all stuck on a boat, if you've seen this, and one of them calls down to room service and says, "Hello, room service, send up more room." And this is what we do in identity. Whenever there is a high-risk transaction, we habitually just pile on more identity. We've put out the fire with gasoline by just doubling up on identification. When in fact what we should have been doing was design thinking all along. and reminding ourselves, what do you really need to know? If you really need to know somebody's credit card number, why don't we put more work into protecting the credit card number instead of piling on more and more auxiliary and circumstantial evidence? We do it because we're in a paradigm. That's an overused term, but you can tell sometimes when you are in a paradigm. We're in a paradigm where our laws of physics are the laws of identity. They have taught us things about identity. They have cemented in our collective minds, the identity industry's minds, certain ways of thinking about problems, and indeed certain metaphors and processes and things for thinking about identity. The laws of identity, I think, made a mistake early on by defining, or as broadly as possible, the concept of digital identity as being any claim, effectively any claim about a subject, which is very broad, and I ran with that. I was down with that for 15 years. And at one level, it's powerful. And the idea that banks and DMVs and employers are identity providers, in air quotes, that's a powerful idea, and I was with it for a long time. But I think it was a colossal misstep. I think what it did was that it led to us personifying and even romanticising identifiers. The first thing I used to say to young people when they came to work for me at Security Domain or Baltimore Technologies was identifiers are not identities. And that seemed to be like Bible truth for the first 10 years of my identity career, and then we sort of lost the plot. And we are, in effect, thanks to the laws, treating identifiers as digital identities. But socials, credit card numbers, driver's license numbers, book codes are identifiers. They're IDs, they are pointers into databases. And they're put together by the people that run the databases because there's not much to it. It's a pointer into a database. And I think that we should stop anthropomorphizing database indices. Tim Boomer, fabulous, one of Canada's leading digital identity thinkers and policymakers, he nailed this about 4.5 years ago, and he's republished this blog just a few months ago. He and I talked about this, and he's delighted to be underpinning this thesis of mine. But I mean, he said it as simple as less identity. He wants less identity as he goes around things. He's cool with the fact that his identifier is less than him. And it's supposed to be less than him. His different identifiers are supposed to disambiguate him or records about him in different stovepipes. So look, I get openness and I get the wish to break down silos, but silos are your friend sometimes when it comes to security and privacy. So we have overdone that idea of breaking down silos. What can we learn from zero trust? The zero trust movement is one of the most paradoxically named things going around. I think it's probably a misnomer, not for the first time, but the idea is that we normally make security promises based on 3 dimensions or 3 factors: technology, people, and processes. And Security 101 is that these things are all equally important. Zero trust is the idea that we can start to make important security promises with less reliance on people and process. So less reliance on the trusted role, the super user in the database center, for example. It's a design modality when you unpack it. It's not literally saying you can't trust or you don't trust or you are trusted because you're not trusted. The semantics are just silly. It's an important call to action at design time to adopt a mindset where you are less reliant on people and process. And that's really important. And we should be carrying that forward into identity design or authentication design. I realised after I'd done this slide that I appear to be prosecuting a definition, and I'm not. I wanted to change this at the last minute. It wasn't possible. I'm really not prosecuting a new definition of anything. I'm just saying that there's a way of design thinking. When you're faced with some sort of challenge, such as who am I really dealing with? Am I dealing with a doctor? You're going to ask yourself 3 questions, I think, in this new paradigm that I'm advocating. You're going to ask yourself first, what do you really need to know about the person that you're transacting with? So what does the first person need to know about the second party? It's usually not identity. I mean, it's been said 3 or 4 times, I wish I was taking notes, but 3 or 4 times in the last 2 days, especially government people say that in their research, citizens are not calling out for identity. You know, you survey people, they don't want identity, they want something else. And it's the same thing when you're in a transaction. You don't normally want identity. I don't need to know the name and address and middle name and favourite colour and social security number of my doctor. I need to know that they're a doctor. So where am I going to get that data from? I'm going to get the data from an institution and not the internet. It's not the internet doctor of medicine. I want to find a degree that's issued by a real university. And how will I know that the information is fit for purpose or true enough for my purpose? Again, I'm going to get signals from not just the institution, but I'm going to get signals even from the presentation, because so much problem arises at the moment from these pinch points where it's the presentation of details are vulnerable. So when you get stuff, it's not just a page off the internet. You want to have some sort of signed assertion that proves the thing that you want to know. So the manner in which you get the data, you know, what do you know? How do you know? I'm always like quoting what I remember my 5-year-old children. It was almost a slogan for them. How do you know? You tell them something about who's the president of England. How do you know? It's almost like children have an instinct to really ask the real question that we should all be asking as professionals when we're designing systems. How do you know? Like, what do you need to know and how do you know it? And I think that that sort of discipline is going to lead to all sorts of better outcomes, and certainly less identity data sloshing around from bad habits of asking questions that we don't actually need to know. So if we could walk back a little bit from identity, where would that leave us? NAB, one of the big Australian banks, we saw a great case study 2 sessions back from some folks who may be here. They've asked for some qualification on this slide that we couldn't make at the last minute, but NAB hosted a roundtable, a really excellent cross-disciplinary meeting of minds to shake down new aspects of digital identity, some fresh thinking, and the reports are online. Very succinct, short reports, and I'm quoting from one of the reports that the group concluded that we collectively in the digital space are conflating identity and identification all the time. And identification is like bread and butter for banks, obviously, but for almost everyone at some point, every business at some point is identifying people for some purpose. And I think that it's just a semantic accident, it's a semantic train wreck that identification and identity seem to be the same thing. So you could be forgiven for thinking that the outcome of identification is identity. And the laws of identity they taught us, the laws of identity said that yes, the outcome of an identification is identity. It's not really how it works, because most identifications are unique or sovereign or contextualised to the point that the outcome is not reusable. It's why federated identity is so paradoxically difficult. All of the really good, well-justified, well-thought-through big identity federations like NSTIC and UK Verify, and in Australia the Trust Centre and God knows what, these systems paradoxically fail. Even card space from Microsoft, a fantastic vehicle for conveying federated identities. It was a commercial failure, and we as an industry haven't really grappled with the truth of that. Like, why the hell did such a really good thing, backed by some of the best people, what happened? And it's because identification is a Tower of Babel. It's because identification follows like a script. There appears to be a grammar of identification insofar as there's common pieces. We check driver's licenses and we check passports and so on. There's a grammar, but it's put together in different ways, in different contexts, because different businesses need to know different things about you. It's really kind of simple. But to reach a state of onboarding a customer where you have a relationship with them and to then call that an identity, that's a semantic and even a conceptual misstep, because it leads most people to think naturally that the identity would be reusable, or the systems would somehow behave like human beings do and manage those different identities. Well, they don't. Computers are digital, they're crisp, they're fragile, and the fine print behind each of those identifications means that the identities are not the same. They're fundamentally different, and that's why federations struggle. So we can see this almost, pseudo-mathematically. This is almost like pseudo-code. But I said that there's a grammar, so there's like maybe 6 attributes that are typically kicking around that you might want to check as an identity provider. So one particular identity provider here, theoretically, is doing a really strenuous job of checking age, date of birth and address, and don't care so much about gender and my university qualifications and so on. So the identity, see how potent those words are? I'm making a mistake myself. I swore I wouldn't. The identification looks like that mathematically. You can characterise it like that. And so it's fantastic if a relying party wants to know to a similar level of rigour my name, date of birth and address. It's great. But a professional association, for example, onboarding me into the College of Physicians, they really want to know that I am an Australian resident and that I've got a board certified certificate. And they're actually not going to check my name and date of birth and address because they're going to assume that that was already done by the colleges 10 years ago. It just doesn't matter to the professional association. So their risk profile leads them to want to know different things about me. So there's that mismatch. And I'm kind of labouring the point, maybe it's just my habit, but I think unpacking the fine print is really worthwhile because we keep calling these things identities, and the reason why they aren't doing what we thought that they would do in the grand federations is because they're not what they seem to be. Where would this leave the profession if we were to move away from identity? Well, the good news is that we have got, through a lot of hard work collectively, we've got an amazing set of technologies for proving attributes and credentials. We call this thing verifiable credentials. It's an amazing set of techniques for proving really specific things about people and also delivering a shed load of metadata about those facts. And of course, in self-sovereign, we're thinking about claims and proofs. In the real world, we just talk about facts and evidence. To me, it all boils down to data and metadata. And we've got these tools that do a fantastic job of accepting data from sources of truth, bundling them up with cryptographic metadata, and then putting them in the hands of people so that they can prove things about themselves peer-to-peer in a decentralised way. Fantastic. If our legacy, if there was some sort of virus that came down and accepted Steve Wilson's crazy thesis that we shouldn't use the word identity anymore and we all were brainwashed by that, the good news is that our legacy would be verifiable credentials technology, which is more fabulously powerful than I think we're even giving it credit for. So here's a bigger idea, leveraging that idea. Security is historically and culturally defensive. It's about keeping the bad guys out. It's about confidentiality and integrity and availability. That's a fairly progressive idea. It's not entirely defensive, but it is, security is about moats and big walls and testing and stuff, which is great. But there's more to life than defence. There's also the question of our assets and our value and how do we protect these things. And if data is, I don't want to use a clumsy metaphor, but if data is important and if it winds up being an important resource, an important asset for the whole economy, like it's clean drinking water or stable electricity, then when are we as a society and as an industry going to start protecting this stuff like we protect clean water? So it's a broader idea of security, and it should be premised on value. Like, what is it that makes data valuable? Where does data value come from? And it's a different story in different use cases. Sometimes you want to know where data has come from. In fact, that's probably fairly universal. The most valuable thing is provenance and origin. But in many cases, you really want to know how old a piece of data is. You want to know how old a phone number is if you think it's being used in a burner account for fraud. If the one thing you knew about a phone number was that it's only 2 days old, that might be a really cool signal to just block an attempted push payment, for example. I'm going to try and amplify that idea in a minute, talking about value chains. Verifiable credentials are classically signed statements about personal credentials of human subjects, like the fact that I'm over 21. or the fact that I've got a particular degree. But what they are data structures with subject data, metadata, and the signature of the authority that's vouching for the fact, and that could be data about anything. We've got lots. There's a few vendors that are talking about verifiable credentials of non-human subjects, which is a powerful idea, but non-human subjects, cars, you could have a verifiable credential for the warranty information about my car, and that would sit in a microcontroller unit. One of the, who was it? Was it Ken Munro? With his fabulous talk about hacking cars and telemetric control units. All of those stuff is just calling out to be populated with verifiable credentials about the car. And we can go even further and talk about verifiable data about any other data. And this is why that's going to be important. It's really old hat that there are data value chains or information value chains in the economy. I've got a credit there for where this particular idea has come from. All sorts of analysts and people talk about this. It's really old hat. Data gets transformed. And we should be metricating or assaying or conveying, we should be capturing the transitions at each point that makes the data valuable. So we should be capturing the story behind the data. And guess what? We've got the technology to do it. Because we bloody well built it over the last 10 years. It's verifiable credentials. So we should have a verifiable credential in a blood pressure meter that is signing the measurement of my blood pressure when I'm in hospital, so that you know where that data has come from. It's come from a certified meter. As we put data together, it's exquisitely important to know where the data has come from. What are the training data sets in these days of AI? So let's sign the data sets as input. Algorithms, even more important. What is the algorithm? Obviously for large language models. Is the data compliant, says who? Have we got permission to use it? Did Alice, 18 months ago, give permission, according to a privacy policy that could be captured in that signature, did she give permission for her data to be used in a particular way? And you're a piece of software, imagine you're a piece of software grabbing in some data which has been processed and evaluated over the last 18 months. And you would kind of like to know as a computer, is that personally identifiable health record of Alice's, is it cool for me to use this? So we should have machine readable proofs of patient consent for that origin data to feed forward in these value chains. Authors are signing off and giving license for their works to be used. So all of these things are what makes data valuable, and we've got the tools to take that stuff and to produce the provenance and the accountability of the things that you really need to know. So I think that zero identity is kind of paradoxically our opportunity to maximise value. The identity industry's finest contribution, I think, at this point in time is the verifiable credential and the wallets. And God, this week has been fantastic for the richness of the thinking and the maturity of wallets and the work that you can see on the trade show floor. I think that that's our finest thing. Once we can start to put that together and generalise it to produce verifiable data about any data, then something magical is going to happen. It's going to make this problem space simpler, because we're going to fall back on principles like those value chains. So it's all hat. Like we've been talking about value chains for 20 years. It's not complicated. And we can embed the authority chains and all of those value things that we deal with every day. We can embed that digitally using verifiable credentials. So it's a much simpler thing. We're not going to find ourselves arguing about definitions about authentication and even identity itself. We can get rid of that complexity and that conceptual sort of mess that we've been in for a long time, and we will solve for a much bigger problem, which is the truthfulness and the fitness of purpose for this stuff called identity. Okay. We edit that. That really stuffed up my clothes. It's the data that matters, and we've got the technology to make that data valuable and to know why it's valuable and to carry that forward. Thank you. Oh, wow. I think it's 5 minutes before the top of the hour, so whether we've got time for questions, not sure. I'm happy to take a question now or carry on outside. Yeah. Oh, how about a slippery answer, both? So the question was, if I heard it properly, there's anonymous identities and there's pseudonymous, or, yep. It's funny because pseudonymous is actually data minimization in action. If anybody needs a quick tutorial on this, so the idea is that there's plenty of cases where you need to know my name, and that's fine, I'm not disagreeing with that. And there's plenty of cases where data might be completely anonymous, like healthcare. And then there's pseudonymous where you, like healthcare again, you would like to give somebody an alias so that nobody knows who it is, and you could do data processing and data collection on the alias patient. We call that pseudonymous because you really want to know that it's a proper patient in a clinical trial, for example. You really want to know that this, let's call them Alice. You really want to know that Alice is a real patient, but I don't want to really know her name. Pseudonymization. So that's data minimization. It's saying to the world who wants to index data by Alice, you don't really need to know Alice's name. You can still use it as an index, so that's great. It's also really important, thank you for the question, to know the story behind the data, because pseudonymization is always premised on the idea that at some point somebody's going to want to break the glass and really know who Alice is, maybe in private, maybe it's the police, or maybe it's the clinical trial manager or something. There's plenty of scenarios where a party will have legitimate interest in backing out and knowing who it really is. So that is the story behind the data. Like, how was the pseudonymization done? And I might as well just say very quickly about anonymization. So the idea that you could just say, here's patient 1234, and there is no way to tell that this is Steve Wilson. That's a promise that as a consultant I say to people, don't make that promise, because people always come unstuck. And people come unstuck in Australia spectacularly 10 years ago. The health department decided to, for every good reason in the world, to make a lot of data available for medical research. So they took the pharmaceutical records. Remember, in Australia we've got subsidised pharmaceuticals, so most prescription meds are close to free. They took 25% of the total data over 20 years of the population, they put it on the internet after de-identifying it. And they did such a bad job that within 3 hours, a PhD student had re-identified enough of that data to really scare the crap out of people. So the reason why I'm telling that great big long story is that the process that you go through to get to a state of anonymisation or pseudonymization or de-identification, whatever you want to call it, knowing what that process is extremely important, and being able to bake that knowledge into the credential that you wind up giving to people. So instead of just saying it's Alice, we should burn that into a verifiable credential, and you can burn the story behind the data into that credential as well. So it's just adding value on value on value. And that must be time. So thanks again.